Well, I want to welcome everyone to The Dig, our contemporary speakeasy here in Pueblo, Colorado. I still can't believe we're more than halfway through, and we have some individuals who, of course, bought the series package. And I thought about it initially. Who's going to want to be here every night? We've practically had full houses almost every single night. And as you notice, we have 3 cameras on the floor, so we do broadcast live. And last week, I shared news that I've gotten calls from Arkansas, Mississippi, New Jersey, New York, Wyoming, Oklahoma, Utah. I got 2 calls from Southern California. So there are people out throughout the United States that are either watching it live Wednesday nights at 6 p.m. or they're following up because they all are archived afterwards. So if you have missed any of them, or if you'd like to watch them again, you can easily do that because they're all on YouTube. And last week was kind of a wake-up call for me. Monique Marez from the Pueblo Food Project really shared some information, and I'll just remind everyone 2 of the facts. And I didn't believe it at first, and then later in the week, I was with Dr. Bartolo on the Pueblo Food and Produce Tour, where we actually went out to 3 farms, then went to Rocky Ford to see the actual research institute, which, unbeknownst to me, is the oldest of its kind in the state, which was founded in 1888. But Pueblo has 839 farms, and 1 in 5 Puebloans go home hungry each evening. So for me, that was a wake-up call. So if that's not enough to get you to help with this Pueblo Food Project, I don't know what else I can say. But I'm going to give you some information. First, a shout out to the Senate. They go out of their way each and every Wednesday. Tonight was the only night that Ken and Gina, the owners, are in Florida, and deservedly so. So thanks for your patience today. And then, of course, we have the entire film crew. Justin Brager is leading it with Jeff, and even Sam Ebersol is here tonight. They're the ones who produced the Rocky Mountain PBS documentary on the Great Flood of Pueblo, which was really extraordinary. So if you have any questions for them, they're actually going to be in the lineup in a few weeks. So if you have any questions, or if you want to make sure you see their presentation, be sure to get tickets. But I'm really excited tonight. Introducing Matt Refic, and I've known Matt almost from the day I arrived in Pueblo on Central Plaza about 10 years ago. So we've had a lot of fun, not only exploring Pueblo, but we've done some amazing road trips together, meeting some extraordinary people in the arts. So when I started to put together the whole lineup for The Dig, which really is a contemporary speakeasy, and the whole motivation is, as we all kind of crawl out of our pandemic caves, hopefully we don't have to go back into them, but the 2 things that we can really do together to build community is to break bread and to share stories. So when I started to look at the stories, many of them were pretty obvious, but then there's so much in the arts that is so fluid, and it really does take someone who is entrenched in the arts in so many different levels. And I can't think of another person more entrenched in kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And when I say ugly, I really mean the messiness. Because for me, that's always been the most interesting part of any storytelling, because that's where all the humanity is in any great story. So as I always do, I'm going to read to you from Matt's bio, and then I'm going to turn the floor over to him. So Matt Refic is a multidisciplinary artist whose work focuses on the exploration, transformation, and integration of trauma through exploring the depths of the human condition and expressing these concepts into works of art and creative healing methods. With over 30 years of art-making experience, Matt has developed a multitude of styles and techniques which are used to serve the community and individuals through visual stimulus that facilitates psychological understanding and spiritual growth. Through painting large-scale murals, Matt began to realize the ways in which art affects communities and the individuals within those communities. The practice eventually led to the facilitation of community participatory art projects, mainly through public murals created by various groups and subcultures within the communities. This practice of group art making led to Matt being an art teacher, facilitator in the federal prison system, primarily at ADX Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies, the most highly secured prison in the United States. Through years of teaching self-expression and creating art alongside inmates at such a highly secured level of imprisonment, Matt was given first-hand access to the stories and characteristics of some of the most notorious individuals in history. It was through making art with these individuals that Matt fully recognized that art can be an incredibly powerful catalyst for changing the path of one's life by changing personal narratives. Through the creative process, we gain access to the deep recesses of our minds, the shadows, where we often store away the aspects of ourselves which are creating disease and unrest. In 2021, Matt created The Depths, which uses art, introspection, communication skills, and various other techniques to guide the participants through a series of steps and procedures that aim to provide tools to explore and understand the deeper, darker parts of ourselves, which often remain hidden and suppressed. Matt currently works and lives in the southwestern United States, moving around often to learn more, share more, create more, and heal more. His primary focus is to reduce and remove systems of restraint through the application of creative principles and the healing of trauma through the arts. I leave it up to you.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Thank you, Gregory, for the introduction. So when Gregory asked me a few months ago to give a talk, I wasn't exactly sure what to speak on. Normally, I speak on a lot of various topics. I've been a working artist for a lot of years, so I have a lot of different experiences and a lot of different things which I've immersed myself in, which I can talk on. But the concept and the name of the program being a contemporary speakeasy, it just sparked the idea of me talking on my understanding of communication and language. So for my whole life, I've been immersed kind of in like troublemaker culture. So I was really interested in like the concept of the ways in which we are hiding languages from each other through subcultures. Like I grew up in a graffiti subculture and train hopping subculture and gang subcultures, and they all have their own languages which they speak in. So I found that very relevant to giving a talk tonight at a speakeasy, because there's so many conversations I've been involved in where it's like you don't talk to other people about these things, and they're very dangerous and risky topics. So, and then for the last 5 years, I've been teaching in the federal prison system, and part of my education through doing that is the ways in which they're communicating and using coded messages and secret messages, and the ways that they speak very easily about what they're hiding from the federal government, and the ways in which they're doing that, and the secret codes that they use. And so I thought that this would be an interesting topic, because I've been immersed in communication and the concept of talking for about the last year, especially, more so than that, because even coming out of like graffiti, I've always been wondering and interested in the ways in which we can use messages to communicate ideas. As a public artist, I communicate ideas to the whole public, to the whole city, right? Like I paint these large-scale murals, and I realized that through doing that, I was communicating ideas to basically everybody that was involved in the city at all. You drive around and you can't miss these ideas that I'm painting all over the place. So I became very interested and started to become very mindful of what I am communicating, because truly the nature of what is happening is that by communicating ideas, we start to form communities. And that's how community is formed, by the ways in which we're communicating ideas to one another. And so often we communicate ideas to one another without being very mindful of what we're communicating to each other. And we're not deliberately communicating the ideas that we necessarily want to communicate because we're not always informed or educated in the ways in which we should or can communicate. And the nuances of communication are so complicated that it makes for a very difficult topic, because it's like communication is language, and the language is what is the codes of our operating systems of our minds. And our minds are operating in these little utterances and these symbols that we see, and that's how we're actually processing reality. Okay, so our voices are like our greatest gift, right? They're our inherent technology, and they give us the opportunity to share ideas and concepts and beliefs and ideas, and we can describe things to one another, and it's the ways in which we are actually sharing and bonding. And it's through this communication, through talking, that we form relationships with one another so often. From the time that we're babies and our mothers and fathers are speaking to us in these utterances, right? Like just so that we can understand words and sounds. That's basically what we are beginning to understand reality as, is the ways which we are communicating these sounds to one another. And we're given this gift, and what it is these frequencies that are leaving our mouths, and those frequencies hit our ears and our brains, and we form ideas and shapes and ideas based around these sounds that are coming out of our mouths. And those sounds then begin to inform our reality, because we not only communicate to one another in those ways, but we actually think in those ways. We think in these words. And these words are defining our realities. They're not just describing our realities, they're actually informing our realities, because the ways in which we describe the situations around us, we are describing them normally in words, or a word that represents an image. And so often we just have these words that we use, and we just have these pictures that we associate with them, and we don't necessarily use them in a way which is completely deliberate. Oftentimes we're just doing it in a way which is like a reactionary way of using words. And that can be problematic, because we're not oftentimes communicating correctly to one another, because we're not being completely mindful of the words in which we're using and being descriptive enough in the use of these frequencies and words to actually define the communication. So often we are uttering these sounds from our mouths, and we have an idea that we're trying to get across, yet the person that is hearing these frequencies leaving our mouths doesn't necessarily process them in their minds the same way that you're describing them. So to express ideas, right? To have an expression, like it's our nature to express. I believe that human beings are expressive beings, right? Like our whole existence is defined by the ways in which we're communicating, by what I'm expressing to you and what you're expressing back to me and to all of us, right? Like, so to express, right, it means like X meaning to pull from, and press meaning pressure. So the pressure coming from ideas and feelings and beliefs that we have creates a pressure within us, and to express them means to pull forth that pressure, right? To let forth an expression, to let forth an idea, a feeling, a belief, whatever. So when we express something, that's our nature. We have just a feeling within us that I need to say this, or I need to act this way, or I need to perform this thing. And so to express is within our nature, and it's what we need to be doing at our highest levels. And that's why it's very important for us to be very mindful of how we're expressing ourselves, by being more mindful of the words that we're using, or our body language, or our facial expressions, right? There's so many ways that we can express through drawing, painting, dancing, right? So when we don't express ourselves, right, we're depressing the concept. So if you have something you want to say and you don't say it, you just suppressed an idea. And through that suppression, the the outcome's going to be depression, right? You're going to become depressed because you're not expressing yourself. So when we suppress ideas, the resulting depression is what we feel and experience when we're having a depression and we want to say something and we have something we need to like express, but we don't know how to do it. So we just, bottle ourselves up and we isolate ourselves. And so that's like oppression is when somebody stops you from expressing yourself. That's what these words, how they come together. And this is the power of words, is that we use them so often and we don't understand what the words mean, even though the words are perfectly describing our experiences. And so often we just pass through life saying depression and expression and oppression and suppression and not really giving mind to what they actually mean. So, and this goes with all words. We can learn to break down the words to understand their meanings. And so this goes inward, right? So like the words which we speak to ourselves are going to define our life experience, right? So we have these words, these ideas of our experiences in life, and through the words which we're saying to ourselves, that's how we're experiencing reality. And by using negative self-talk or positive self-talk, that's going to define our life experiences. So if we use words which are positive and we use words which are reinforcing what we want and reinforcing the experience which we want to have, that's going to produce that reality, because the words which we speak don't just describe reality, they actually generate reality. So the words in which we're using to communicate ideas to one another are actually defining the ways in which we are experiencing reality. And everybody in this room experiences reality in a different way because the words have different meanings to every single person in here. So I can say a word such as beautiful or tree, and it conjures up an idea in all of you of what's beautiful or what is a tree. But what you have an idea of what a tree is different than my idea of a tree. So when we communicate ideas, we are communicating the differences of tree to one another. Like, so we have to be very descriptive and meaningful in what we're saying, not just to one another, but to ourselves, so that we have a more clearly defined definition of what our reality is going to be. Okay, so word magic is something that became really, it's similar to how I just described depression, suppression, oppression, but words can be the thing which are trapping us in reality. People can tell you words and they can make you have a belief through the words in which they've told you, like a wizard casting a spell. Okay, so people tell us words all the time, and we take those words for the value, and then we just hold those words for their meaning, right? So the example that kind of broke this down for me was the banking system, right? So I was an inmate who identifies as a sovereign citizen, right? He was explaining to me the ways in which we are being trapped by what's called like legalese, right? Like these specific words that we think mean a certain thing, but they actually mean a completely different thing. So the example that I was shown this through is through the banking system, right? So we put our money in a bank, but the word bank, what is it? It refers to like a bank of a river, right? And what the banks of a river do is they contain a current, right? They contain the current of water. But what a banking system does with money is they control the flow of currency. So what the banking system is doing, and that's why it's called a bank, is it controls the flow of currency. And currency being human energy. So what a banking system does in order to control us is they control the flow of human energy through the banks, right? They represent our human energy through a number, a money denomination, and it represents a set amount of human energy. Like for $1, this person will do this much work, and that's how the banking system works, and that's the world in which we're confined into. And that's just one example of the ways in which words are capturing our lives without us understanding necessarily that people can tell us certain words, and then through those words they can define the actions that we're taking without us really understanding what we're doing because we don't understand what those words mean. And it happens all the time. If you start to break down every single word, like you'll notice these repetitions of words, and it's like, why is that the same word, right? Like the banking system, right? Like I didn't understand that until somebody told me. But there's so many words that are like this, right? Like every word is basically used in a specific way in order to control the ways in which we're taking actions. But once you start to understand the ways in which the words are affecting us and controlling us, then you can start to break free and start to see that, like, literally, we've had spells cast upon us, right? Like, it's like truly what it is. And I mean, you can start breaking this down so far, and there's like numerous books and so much like talks about this subject. But I mean, when you look at words such as like spell casting, for example, what it means is like to cast a spell, right? I said a word, and just like I told you that it's like the banks of a river, like it's the same thing. I cast a spell upon you, and you think that it means this one thing when really it means something else. So another fun one that I find interesting is like, so back in the days when wizards like Merlin would cast a spell, they would channel the spell through a piece of wood, right? Usually the wood of a holly tree. So the holly wood, right, represents the spell-casting faction of the world, and they're casting spells upon all of us by shedding forth all these words that we listen and we believe to be true, and they cast the Hollywood spell, right? So that's just another example of the ways in which word magic is actually like trapping us into these ways of thinking. And even though these may seem kind of elementary or childish, like it's very universal, and it goes across all words. You can start breaking down all words, just like I did with expression, depression, suppression, oppression, right? Like you can break down all words that way through just an etymology dictionary, and you can find that the English language is basically a trap for us to like process words in these certain ways, and there's certain nuances in the English language which will forever enslave us in our minds if we don't learn to actually start breaking down the words and using them properly. And it really starts with how we're communicating with one another by speaking more slowly and being more mindful of the words which we're using, so that we're more deliberately using the words which we know so that they convey the meaning that you really want them to mean. Okay, so verbs are a really interesting part of this because it's like, I believe that like in the English language we're taught a lot of nouns, okay? But in earth languages, like languages that are coming out of like Native American cultures or Aboriginal cultures, they don't really use nouns very much. They mostly speak in verbs. So they don't describe a cup as an inanimate object. Like it's a cup, but what it is it's a verb. It's a structure of glass which is holding water, and that water is then set forth to sustain your life. And that's how they describe the table or the floor or the chair. It's not an inanimate object. It's a living thing which has life and serves a purpose. And they describe all things in that manner so that everything is alive and everything serves a purpose. So whenever you speak of anything, it's not death. You never speak death into existence. You're speaking life into all things. So you speak in as many verbs as you possibly can. And when you speak forth with verbs and you speak forth with life, then what you're doing is you're using your generative voice to bring life into the world. And instead of ever describing anything as death, you describe everything as life. And you have a new respect for all things because everything's a living thing that serves a purpose, and nothing is wasted on just being, inanimate matter, but rather something that's a living thing, which is true. Like everything around us is actually a living thing. Like nothing is just sitting still. It's all has an actual life to it. We just tend to neglect the idea of a glass cup. We just say it's a cup when really it's actually this beautiful thing that actually sustains life and, gives me water and holds the key to life for me. And so if you can learn to appreciate all things through the description of them by being more mindful of how much value things actually hold, then you live life in a way that is giving forth more appreciation and more life. And we need to speak to ourselves and speak to others in those ways. So words, like another part of what came out, how this topic became very important to me, was that I realized that when I was triggered or angry, that I could say things that I didn't necessarily want to say. And I would say mean things or angry things or just things that were unnecessary, right? So I started to really analyze what it was within myself that was actually causing me to speak and where my words were actually coming from, because oftentimes you'll just say something in response, and oftentimes those responses are related to an emotion, and those emotions are going to be negative, and you're then going to like say something negative, and you're going to like hurt somebody. So the word sword, which is an interesting word because words, if you take the S from words and put it in the front, it becomes a sword, and that's how you can cut somebody down, and you can really hurt somebody with your words. And words have this amazing power to like hurt or heal, because words, I believe, are truly the greatest and most potent thing that we as human beings possess, because they are informing the ways which we think and the ways in which we experience reality. So without being mindful of it, oftentimes we can use our words in a way that are very harmful, and we can cut people down without understanding that we just cut them down and permanently hurt them, right? So like you can shame somebody, right, and say like, oh, you should be ashamed of that, right? But like to say that to somebody can permanently damage them, right? They can carry that shame with them for the rest of their lives, and you didn't even realize that. You just said it out of like, you know, your response to something. You said like, oh, you should be ashamed of that, or like, you shouldn't wear that dress, or whatever it was that you like shamed somebody about. Like you just put your words in their mind, and they will forever carry those words, and it's very difficult to undo those words, right? And you can't even protect yourself from it sometimes. Like somebody can just walk up to you and be like, you're stupid or you're ugly, right? And you can't stop them from doing that. And that person just cut you so deeply that for the rest of your life, you may have shame from that. And so often we do that without really being mindful of how we are doing that to one another. And so we need to be really, really mindful of the ways in which we speak to one another, because there's no need to ever infect other people with shame or anger or guilt or sadness, because it's yours. You don't need to share it, and it's incredibly infectious. And you can say these things and infect somebody else with your words and not even understand that you just permanently hurt that person, and it can almost not even be undone, even through therapy or whatever you're going through. It's really difficult to undo these things. So we need to ultimately just be so mindful that when we speak words into reality and other people are hearing them, we need to be speaking words which are building people up in the same way that you want to be built up. You want to share words so that you're forming community and forming bonds which are trustworthy. You don't want to share words with one another which are ever going to be damaging, because you may damage somebody by saying something that's mean, and they may create a cascade effect where then they'll say something that damages somebody else, and so forth and so on. And it's like a disease, and you can't stop it unless it just takes one person to understand that they cannot share those words anymore, and they need to understand where those words are coming from. And that's why we should speak kindly to one another, and we should learn to process ideas properly. So I believe that we have 3 mind centers. We have the feelings in our guts, we have the feelings in our hearts, and we have the ideas in our minds. And when we have a feeling, right, our gut feeling, that's our first center. Like, what does this mean? What's going on right now? Like somebody says something to you, and you start to just understand what's making you feel, right? And then you then process that through your heart. Like, what does this thing have? What are these words or these ideas that I'm having? What part of that is love? And how do I find love in all things, right? So when you're having an idea or you want to say something to somebody because you don't want to share the shame and the infection, you want to be like, how do I turn whatever this is into love, no matter what it is? Even if it's your anger, you have to process it through love. And then once you understand what could be found in love with that thing, and I believe all things can, like part of my work working with violent offenders is that like I find love in all things. Even if it's a serial killer, I'm like, there's love in this person. There's love in this killer. There's love in this thing. I just have to find where it's at. And so when I find that love, and no matter how dark this idea is, when I find that love, then I process it through my mind and I say, what words do I want to express that will bring forth love, so that the words which are leaving my mouth are going to bring forth healing, that are going to bring forth growth and joy and community and connection? Because I don't want to be forth like, oh, I'm so disappointed in you because you killed somebody. I want to bring forth the words that are like, I don't know what you went through, but I'm still here to love you. And I want those words to come through my mouth so that that person can then process love through their mind instead of processing this normal shame that they're having. So anytime that I'm trying to express anything, and this is, to me, what the great work of being a human is that you have to continuously work at this, and you have to continuously try to find better ways to express ideas, no matter what they are, whether I'm giving speeches, or if I'm making a painting or doing a dance or whatever it may be. If I have the opportunity to capture somebody's attention, I have to use that opportunity to then build that person up and use the greatest part of myself and give that to them, so that then they carry the greatest part of themselves and are able to then bring forth more love and harmony and community to one another through community and common expressions. And so that's really like what the concept of this whole talk is like, how do we bring forth more love into the community? Like I have worked as a public artist for years, and I've been in a public space for so long, and so often what I'm painting has been in the past like kind of mindless, and I wasn't necessarily bringing forth truth that I needed to bring forth because I didn't understand what that was yet. But now in my life and career, I understand that like if I bring forth something into a community space, it has to be something which is going to build the community up. Like I can't bring forth negativity because I don't want the frequencies coming out of my mouth or my body to resonate with anybody that's ever going to cause damage to anybody. And if we can all be mindful in this way, and like in the future, if I produce works of public art which everybody sees, I want them to represent a frequency and an idea which builds people up and brings forth concepts of peace within their hearts, so that when they are exposed to these ideas, it brings forth more peace within the reality and in everybody's consciousness, because I can affect the way people are thinking simply by capturing their attention. And we all have this ability, and we all do it all the time. I do it on a really large scale, and I capture a lot of people's attention, and this is how I've come to understand it, is that if I bring forth a concept and I capture people's attention, it's my responsibility to bring forth peace, right? I need to speak peace into consciousness so that people experience peace. No matter what I'm doing, no matter how I'm interacting with people in life, no matter if I'm angry or sad or whatever, I need to process it through my gut, through my heart, and through my mind, and bring forth this idea in a way that's understanding and love-filled. Because hostility and anger and violence, it never solves anything, and it's incredibly infectious. It's like when I work with violent people, and it creates a cycle of violence, right? Like so many times I work with people that are incredibly violent, and the reason they're incredibly violent is because incredibly violent things happen to them. And they didn't know how to stop the cycle. Nobody was there for them to help them stop the cycle. So you infect some child with abuse, and then that abuse becomes their trauma, and then their abuse, and that's what they're bringing forth. And the only way to stop that cycle is to bring forth your love to them. And that's why when we, as individuals, ever have the opportunity to share an idea with anybody, it should be bringing forth peace to one another, because you don't know where people are at. Like, it's the same concept of the tree, right? Like, my idea of a tree is different than yours. Like, well, that person's concept of their reality that day is completely different than yours. But if you can then show them a concept of peace and love, you may just infect them with that for the day. And if they can continue with that cycle, then they're able to bring forth that into consciousness. And to me, this is the ways in which we heal. Because as we experience reality as individuals, we have ideas going through our minds, and those are our personal stories. And those are the ways that we're speaking to ourselves. And if we're able to change the ways in which we're speaking to ourselves, if we're able to change the ways which we define ourselves through the words which we think, then we can have a profound effect on our lives, but also the lives of everybody around us. And the more that we can develop ways of having love for ourselves and positive self-talk and proper ways of processing information through using correct words, then the more harmony we're going to have as a community, because we're not sovereign beings. We are all connected, right? Like a byproduct of depression is isolation, right? And so when we punish the worst of the worst, we send them to the super maximum security prison, and it's isolation. That's what it is. It's 23 hours a day of isolation, and then an hour a day where they're not isolated with 2 other people. And oftentimes that's the rest of their lives. And that's like the ultimate punishment, because it's worse than torture. It is torturous, because to strip people from human interactions it strips people of humanity. It takes away everything that they know, because they no longer have the ability to express things to one another. And that's what causes so much struggle. But the ways in which we're communicating ideas is what creates so much beauty. And we don't ever want to communicate ideas to one another which do anything but create beauty, because we don't want to isolate ourselves. And when you speak violence, you're creating isolation. You're pushing people away, and all that does is create suffering. And to move past the suffering, what we need to do is learn to speak peace. So the word abracadabra, right? It means roughly like, as I speak, I create, right? And I truly believe that the words which we speak do not just describe reality, they actually generate reality. And by speaking words which you wish to see in the world, you can generate a reality which is whatever you want it to be, whether it's peace or violence. But when we speak violence, it creates disharmony, and it causes suffering for all those around us. And when we speak peace, it creates love and understanding for everybody which you infect, and everybody which you touch. And that's the role and our responsibility as humans. Whatever you may do, if you can bring forth ideas of harmony and peace and understanding, then I believe that you're living your best life, and there's no higher way that you can possibly live your life other than being a being which expresses peace and love into the community. And no matter what you're doing, whether you're painting or dancing or singing, if you have anybody's attention ever, I do believe that that's what our lives are meant to do. So ultimately, yeah, that's the point that I was trying to get across tonight. And it has so many different facets to it. Language is such an interesting part of the human experience. Linguistics is actually a very unexplored science. There's so many different little nuances to language, and the ways in which that it's affecting all of us. That talk just now was like kind of just one concept of the power of language, but when you really start getting into language, it's such a fascinating topic, because you start to understand that we are all humans in this experience, and we're all living life in this way, which is so fascinating and different, right? So like another interesting thing that I find in it is the ways in which language defines our reality. So if you speak different languages, you are actually physically having a different life experience from other people. And we all have different life experiences because we describe things in different ways. But if you think of the differences between different languages, right? Like German and Spanish, right? So a lot of languages are broken down into genders, right? But when you say gender in language, it actually refers to generic, and it's a generalization. So it's a masculine or feminine word, right? It's not necessarily referring to the sex of the word as much as it is like the characteristics of that word. So it's a way that you can make things generalized. That's why it's called a gender. So it's a masculine or feminine. And so in some languages, right, like in German, a certain word will have a masculine gender, and in Spanish, it'll have a feminine gender. So in Spanish, they'll describe a word, and it's like, oh, that's this soft and subtle thing. But in German, the exact same object is actually like this hard, rigid, strong thing. And so the ways in which we're living life is actually very much being defined by the actual language that we're speaking, and the ways in which we're defining the different things in our lives based upon our experience with it. Just like going back to that tree, like you might have a whole different experience of the word tree than I do. And I guarantee you do. Like if I just say tree, everybody in here is like, if I say picture a tree, you're going to picture a tree that's your tree and it's not anybody else's tree. And that's the same with all languages. And so I think that that's another really fascinating thing when we're trying to understand communication and why we shouldn't get angry at other people over different belief systems, because they have completely different models in their head which they're living by. So we should never be like, oh, somebody's more ignorant or they know less than us or their way of living is completely wrong compared to mine. It's just they have a different way of understanding the world. and those understandings are what make us so unique, and that's what makes human beings so like magnificent, and why we can create so many magnificent things, because we do think in different ways, and we don't have to all think the exact same thoughts all the time. And it's actually quite beautiful that we all have different belief systems, however crazy they are. As long as you're not bringing forth violence into the world, if you think a different thought, it's beautiful, no matter what it is. And we shouldn't argue, and we shouldn't fight about it, because we should just learn to like communicate ideas, and instead of being like, oh, that's against what I believe, like be like, well, I want to understand what you believe, so like, let me process it through my gut, my heart, and my mind, so that at least I have an understanding of your view of reality. And then you have that view of reality, and then you can do whatever you want, but it like actually expands your mind instead of being like, oh, I'm going to just stop this person right there from thinking their thoughts. I'm going to accept their thoughts and be open-minded to what they're thinking so that I can then have a greater understanding of consciousness. Because whenever we stop at people and be like, oh, that way of thinking is completely wrong, I completely disagree with that, well, then you kind of like just like inhibited your own growth of your own mind. And we shouldn't do that. We should all be working constantly to expand our minds, because we have that ability as human beings to like share ideas and expand our minds. And I do believe that that is what we need to be doing as a community. So this event is beautiful because it gives us an opportunity for me to share what I've gained over my years of being an artist and my work with people in isolation and my unique life experience, and then put it in your minds, and then you can apply these ideas, whatever they mean to you, and you can apply them to your life. And I can then move on as an artist and be like, okay, well, I'm going to then expand my mind in these other ways, and then I'll find a way as an artist, as an expressive being, to share those ideas with whoever's going to listen to me next. So I hope that like in this talk that what you can be inspired to be more mindful of the words which you use, and then understand that if you start to be more mindful with the words you're using, that your life will transform, that your experience is going to change just simply based on being very mindful of what you're saying. So my ultimate advice really is this: to slow down when we're speaking and really think about the words which we're using, and come to an understanding of the ways which the words that we're using are affecting one another. And through that, that's how we are all artists, and that's how we all form community, is through being very mindful of sharing ideas in ways which are very well thought out and meaningful. And I hope that through this talk, that's what I've shared with all of you tonight. So.
Thank you. Before we go to questions, Matt, can you show the 4 books? That Matt has a series of books that he's published, which I know many of you have already purchased them. But I wanted Matt just to take a second to introduce the 4 books. And if you'd like one, they are available in the back. And then we'll go to some questions.
So part of my practice is more recently, but I've always been into making books, is a lot of these different concepts that I come up with, I create a book based around it. The first one that I created in this series, at least, was Meet Your Monsters, and what it was is it's a coloring book and self-assessment which is distributed in the federal prison system to the inmates, and it's a questionnaire, and a coloring book. So each page has a picture that you color, and then a series of questions such as like, what's your biggest fear, what's a time that you felt brave, and then explore being brave while coloring the picture. And so basically that was the first book. It's something that the psychology staff in the prison gives out to all the various inmates, and they just can take it back to their cell, and it's something that the psychologists use in order to kind of gain insights when they're giving therapy or doing their group sessions, just to give them something to talk about, like, what was something you were proud of, or when was a time when you overcame fear. And it kind of gives them something to do in their cells while they're, having 23 hours a day of isolation. So that gives them something to do. And then the light work book is kind of the same thing, but it's just more about, it's all positive. Like, how can you bring more light into the world? Or like, what does light mean to you? Or what ways can you bring more light? And it's actually all black pages, and you actually color it with colored pencils or gel pens. And then it's like a journal, and you just kind of bring forth the ways in which you can actually bring more color and harmony into the world. This book, Withdraw, is, I actually spent 5 days in a cave last year, and I wrote a book where I didn't speak. And it was all about purging ideas. So it's kind of like representative of just like scribbles coming out of me is what it was. It was like I was trying to not speak. I was just trying to explore my own inner voice. And so through inhibiting any kind of form, I just scribbled a bunch of ideas and gave shape to a bunch of different scribbles and bubbles and different things which represent the purging of ideas out of my body. And so that is, what it actually is a lesson on automatic drawing. And it's a way for us to flow ideas, like achieve a flow state without inhibiting consciousness. Like, so often we're like, oh, I can't draw a picture. I'm just like, you can definitely draw a scribble. And so one of the lessons that I teach is that you can just scribble ideas, and eventually it will take form into something that essentially, they just become these like blobs, and there's like, these different kind of shapes that were coming out of that. And then I've always made zines. This is a collaboration of me and my friend. It's called Culture Decay. And it's exploring culture decay, which is what culture decay is when one generation starts to age, the next generation's culture starts to take over it. So it's like what's happening with like boomers and millennials, right? Like the millennial are starting to be at the forefront of what culture is, and then eventually the millennial culture will start to decline, and Gen Z will start to be like at the forefront of what is representing mass culture. So that's what culture decay is, and so what I did was we explored graffiti and vandalism and the decay of actual communities and the ways in which neglect happens. Like I've always been very interested in like the alleyways and neglected parts of cities, and to watch the ways in which something is built and then how it just declines and nobody really pays attention to ways like the backs of buildings just fall apart and nobody is ever there to see them. So it's just really exploring those concepts of the ways in which we build, one generation builds this thing up and then it'll just eventually start to decline and fall apart and kind of fall out of sight, out of mind. So that's that book. And I'm currently working on a book about language and what I'm speaking on right now, and just still exploring that topic and the ways in which we can communicate ideas through words and through the written word and through the spoken word, and the ways in which we can all apply those to our lives.
Great. So. Any questions? Huh? Questions? Anyone have any questions? Yeah?
So thanks, Matt. Appreciate your talk, and as a communications professor, it prompted a lot of thoughts in my mind. So based on your talk tonight, my first question is, what do you think about Twitter? No, I'm just kidding. That's not a question. I'm kidding. Here's my real question. Communication theorists can talk or discuss for hours on end about where meaning resides. So you are the source of the message, the sender of the message, the artist, and you encode your message, whether it's a painting on the side of a building or one of your books, and then the receiver, the recipient, or the audience for that takes your message and interprets that. Where does the meaning reside? And based on your understanding, what does that say about your obligation as the speaker, as the source of the message, to make sure that the audience or the recipient of the message takes away what you intended to communicate?
Well, that's the difficulty in this whole process is that for me to communicate an idea, I'm processing it through my processing factors, right? The way that I'm thinking. And so my responsibility as an artist and as a communicator is to process it in a way where I feel that I'm reaching the most amount of people by simplifying it as much as I can so that I can give it the best generalized meaning, even though I know that the way that it's hitting every single person in this room is different. It's just like a book, right? You read a book once and it's this one thing, and you read it again and it's a different thing, right? Well, that's like communication across the board. Like everybody sees a different movie. Everybody reads a different book. So the best I can do is to process it in such a way that I communicate the ideas as simply and effectively as I can, like saying, the concept of this talk was like, how do I speak peace forth, right? Like, so what does peace mean to me? It's like the lack of anxiety, the lack of depression, right? So I want to speak my version of that, right? I want to speak my version of no depression and no anxiety, and I want to share that idea, and hopefully it hits the listener in such a way that it doesn't invoke anxiety or gives them an understanding of their own meaning of what peace means to them. And I hope that they've had some education or some lesson where the peace means somewhat closely to what it means to me, even though I know that it's a completely different thing. Just like the tree. Like when I say peace, it means something different to every single person in here, because the concept in our mind is completely different. So I think that as long as I can bring forth the energy in a way that's bringing harmony, right? Like I want to be gentle and I want to be soft, so that at least I know that that's something that we can go back to our roots and our primal state of like, well, we'd like to be treated gently. So if I can at least express the idea in a gentle way, then at least that's the way that I can almost intend for it to hit as many people in here as I can, is that at least it's gentle. And then you can take the words and the jumble of words that I shared tonight, or pictures or whatever it is, and then express that back out in your own gentle way.
Any other questions?
It's not really a question, it's just my response. And I wanted to just say that a couple of things. One, I loved what you said about language being, meaning so many different things to different people, and therefore having the capacity to open our minds and our hearts and our guts, right? But our minds particularly. So I'm thinking about cultures where I was in Japan for a little while, and I remember trying to do a project there where I was exploring the meaning of a word. And we spent all night, we didn't sleep, talking about tree. How many words, what kind of tree? In Japanese, there are, I don't even know how many words for tree, right? So that just really struck me. And I love that idea that you're communicating about how when we're open, we just create more openness. The other thing that really, really struck me, and I love the idea of, and it kind of blows my mind to really think about it, is the idea that some languages don't contain many nouns, and that when you express in terms of verbs, then everything is alive. To me, that is just so profound. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, for sure. I found that so interesting too, and I had read that. It was a Lakota man, a lecturer, and he was speaking on how in the Lakota language they speak mostly in verbs, and how their understanding of reality is so filled with life, because every word they speak is filled with life. Nothing's dead. Everything's this living thing, and how that's why they find harmony with the earth, because they see that there is life in all things and they respect all life.
Thanks for your talk. It was very inspirational, informative. I wondered if you had heard of Landmark Forum.
I have heard of it. I've never participated in it, though.
Okay, some of your ideas around stories and trauma and limitations are in that leadership training as well.
Oh, nice.
And I am just really inspired by the way that you partner with small businesses to help their marketing, like Ringside or Roots Recycling and things, and the project in La Gente at the dog patch with Colorado Trust. Some of those have been really inclusive and progressive, and I want to know what's coming up next and what else. Do you have any advice about a ritual like meditation or something? I heard mindfulness a few times. What can we all do to get to know our creator within, or to get past some of those inhibitions to allow the creativity to flow more freely?
So my main focus as a public artist now is those inclusivity projects. Like I feel as if I'm going to work on a project in a public space, that it should be not just my voice, but the voices of the community. Yeah. Well, and so often, like, I paint these murals, and they're very, look at me type things, and that has given me a really loud voice, but it's also, I feel like the most important thing is to give everybody that voice, and that everybody in the whole community should be expressing themselves, because every idea is valuable. Everybody's version of a tree is really important, and we shouldn't just give voice to those people that want to be loud, but everybody should have their voice, and everybody should be a public artist, and everybody should be at least in my opinion, should be, if you want to be being heard within the community, because that's how the community is formed, and that's what gives so much strength and pride in a community, is the ability for as many voices to be heard as possible, not just the people with the privilege like myself to have a really loud voice, but everybody should have that voice. And so when I work with prisoners especially, it's like the greatest gift of my life is to give them a voice and give them an art show every year and paint murals with them, and to take people that have voices, beautiful voices, and to amplify their voices, to me is like where I most put my attention as a public artist now. I find that to be the most important work that I can do, is to give as many people those voices as possible. And so for me, the way that I develop my voice is through mindfulness practice. I meditate a lot. I try to meditate an hour a day every day, and just go in and really assess that voice within my head. When I spent the 5 days in a cave, I didn't speak a word, right? And when you spend that much time without talking, you realize that the voice within your head is your actual voice, right? Like, this is like this weird technology that we have, and it's a weird tool that we have, and it's this beautiful thing that we have to communicate ideas, but I can shut it off anytime, is where the mind, it always goes, the voice inside of our heads is constantly going. And once we come to understand the voice inside of our head is our higher and true selves, we can learn to listen to it, and we can learn to have communication with like what I call infinite intelligence. Like, you start receiving communications from places where you do not understand where these ideas are coming from. And we're all doing that, but oftentimes we just block it out. We speak, and we don't talk. We don't acknowledge that the voice inside of our head is receiving all this information constantly. And it's with my artistic practice. Like, I have no idea where some of these ideas come from. And it's kind of like a common thing among artists and thinkers. They're like, it'll pop into your head. It just shows up. And if you take the time to really analyze your mind and the voice inside your head, you start to access your forms of genius. And that's where deep thought comes from. And that's where our greatest abilities as humans come from, is when we slow down and really start to analyze our mental processing systems and the words which we're speaking to ourselves, or the words that are just going on within our heads, whether it's some form of higher consciousness talking to us, or it's just neurofeedback loops, whatever it is. Those things are defining our reality. You can't deny it, because once you quit talking and you just listen to the voice inside your head, you start to have a different understanding of reality itself. So I definitely try to slow down and listen to my subconscious mind as much as possible, just to analyze really where I'm at.
So with that, we're going to wrap up this session of The Dig. I have something that Matt said that really kind of stopped me in my tracks, which I will leave you with. But before I do that, first of all, if you didn't grab your amazing rainbow chocolate chip cookies and your lemon ginger cookies from the Sacred Bean, be sure to do so. And if you didn't get your you're carved for your free designer coffee wherever they are in town, and you can find them on Facebook. Be sure to get that. And then Matt's books are available. The 3 books are $10 each, and then the special one, which has some actual artwork that he has created, original artwork, that one is $25. So those are available in the back. But and then next week, Jane Frazier is going to be our speaker, our storyteller. Jane Frazier, for 25 years, was the chair of the CSUP engineering department. And she's going to do a whole talk on Pueblo Makes. And several years ago, she formed an umbrella organization called Pueblo Makes, which, if you haven't heard about it, it's a pretty extraordinary umbrella organization. But she grew up in a maker town, and I've already seen some of the slides, and she goes back to her childhood, and it's really exciting. So she's going to be doing that next week. But I want to leave you with that. Matt said, the great work of being a human being is ... And I'm going to leave you with that word. So until next week, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks, Matt.
Thank you.